Hello everyone, welcome to a new sewing video with Burda. Today we are going to sew a lovely mini dress that features a decorative piping finish from the May 2023 issue of Burda Style. This dress is sewn from a flowy viscose with a colorful paisley print. To sew this dress, you will need piping, interfacing, and matching thread for your sewing machine. In addition to your usual sewing supplies, you will also need sewing machine needles and hand sewing needles. This dress is a real eye-catcher, even without the decorative piping. Before you begin, make sure you determine which is the best Burda size for you. You can find the size chart and various dimensions in your Burda Style magazine. This dress will require you to know your chest and hip size. Check out our video, How to Take Your Measurements, to learn how this is done. You will find your pattern pieces in this template, which you can cut out or transfer. After you transfer the pieces, add a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters along the line of all your pattern pieces. Note that for this pattern, you'll need to glue pieces 16A and 16B together along their adjoining line. You can now cut out the fabric. Please refer to the cutting layout in your magazine to see how the pattern pieces are arranged on the fabric. When folding the fabric in half, the right side should be on the inside and the selvages should be placed on top of each other. Now pin the pattern pieces onto the fabric according to the cutting layout. Mark a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance on the fabric parallel to the edges of the pieces. Now cut the pieces along the chalk lines. Add interfacing to the pieces 3, 4, 6, 7, 10, and 13. Cut the pieces from the interfacing and press this to the back of the fabric pieces with light pressure while making sure you keep the iron from sliding around. Place the pieces once again on top of each other, right sides together, and pin. Before I remove the pattern pieces from the fabric, I transfer the outline of the pattern, notches, and hemlines onto the fabric. To do this, it is best to use a tracing wheel and Burda Style carbon paper. You can find detailed instructions in the carbon paper packaging for more information. Don't forget to transfer the center front and top stitch lines to the right side of the fabric with basting stitches. Now it's time to start sewing. For viscose fabrics, it is best to use a needle with a thickness of 60 to 80. As always, our needles are from Schmetz. I start with the bust darts. I pin the seam lines together, right sides together. I stitch the darts from the side edge to the tip. I secure the beginning of the seam with the back stitches and notch the threads at the tip. Then I press the darts downward. I then gather the front and back pieces. To do this, I stitch long stitches along the seam line of the top edge to make 2 parallel lines. I pull on the bottom gathering threads to reduce the length of the edges so that they are the same length as the yoke. I tie the threads and distribute the gathers evenly. The piping finish is often used throughout the dressmaking process, so I will show you how to do it. I pin the piping on the seam allowances so that its raised part is on the garment piece and the flat ribbon is on the seam allowance. I make sure that the seam of the raised part of the piping is exactly on the seam line so that it will not be visible once the garment is finished. Then, I stitch as close as possible along the raised part of the piping. I baste the piping by using a sewing machine to stitch with large stitches flush along its seam. I pin and stitch the back yoke onto the back and the front yokes onto the fronts. Now, I neaten the edges together. I use a serger for this, but you can also use a zigzag stitch or an overlock stitch on your sewing machine to do this. I top stitch the yokes flush with their edges and press the seam allowances into the yokes. To finish, I remove the gathering threads still visible on the front. I now sew the shoulder seams of the front and back. I pin the shoulder seams of the yoke and the pieces with and without interfacing together. I stitch along the seam line and press the seam allowances open. I baste the piping along the edge of the facing for the fronts and the yoke like I showed you before. I pin the facing right sides together over the piping, starting at the shoulder seams. I stitch along the seam line, lay the facing in the neckline, top stitch it flush along the seam, and press the allowances into the facing. Next, I place the facing without the interfacing on the facing that's already been stitched, overlapping the shoulder seams as I do so. I stitch the edges together along the seam line, check the finished width with a ruler, and correct it if necessary. I trim the seam allowances and clip where needed. I turn the facing inside out. Now, I join the edges and top stitch them flush. I fold over the seam allowance of the inside edge of the facing and pin it to the seam. To make it easier to top stitch, I transfer the pins to the right side before stitching. From the right side, I top stitch the facing in the seam by stitching the inside edge. It is now time to do the side edges of the fronts, back, and waistband pieces. I lay the fronts and back down and stitch the side seams. Then I press the seams open. I fold the allowances of the bottom edge of the waistband that does not have interfacing to the wrong side. I place the waistband with the interfacing right sides together onto the bottom edge of the bodice, making sure the seam allowances overlap and that the waistband's allowances extend beyond the front edges. I then pin the right side of the waistband without interfacing onto the wrong side of the bodice, opposite the waistband with the interfacing. I stitch the waistband and its front edges, holding onto the bodice between the layers as I do so. I trim the seam allowances and clip the corners. I fold the waistbands down and press the seam. I continue with the skirt and the ruffle. I stitch the darts to their tip, secure the beginning of the seam with back stitches, and tie the threads at the tip. I press the darts toward the middle back. I neaten the side edges of the skirt pieces and all edges of the ruffle pieces except for their upper edge. I place the front pieces on the back pieces and stitch the side seams. I press the seams open. And now the ruffle. I fold the allowances of the front and bottom edges of the ruffle to the wrong side and press. Then I stitch the hem before moving on to the front edges. Now I place the ruffle on the skirt and gather the top edge so that its length is the same length as the bottom edge of the skirt. I baste the piping on the top edge of the ruffle like I did before with the yoke. Then I take the ends of the front edges and fold them upwards. I pin the ruffle onto the bottom edge of the skirt, right sides together. Here, the allowances of the front edge of the skirt extend past it. I do not fold the ruffle down at this time. I neaten the inside edge of the front facings and pin them onto the front edge of the skirt fronts and the bottom edge right sides together. I stitch the facings and then the ruffle. Finally, I stitch the front edges. I pin the skirt onto the bottom edge of the outer waistband, right sides together, overlapping the side seams as I do so. I stitch along the seam line and press the allowances into the waistband. Now I pin the inside edge of the waistband over the seam. From the right side, I top stitch the waistband all the way around its edges and make sure to stitch the inner waistband. To make this step easier, you can transfer the pins to the right side before top stitching. Now, the sleeves. I top stitch the long edges of the sleeves and then stitch. I press the seams open. I gather the bottom edge of the sleeves like I did with the ruffle and reduce the length to the length of the cuffs. I pin the piping onto the bottom edge of the sleeves and fold the ends downward. Now, I fold the allowances of the upper edge of the cuffs and press. I then baste the piping on the bottom edge of the cuffs with interfacing. I stitch the ends of each cuff to close them and press the seams open. I pin the cuffs with piping onto the cuffs without piping, right sides together, and stitch their bottom edges together using the zipper foot. I trim the seam allowances. Then, I turn the cuffs right side out and press. I now stitch the cuffs onto the sleeves. I pin the cuffs with interfacing onto the bottom edge of the sleeves, right sides together. I stitch along the seam line and press the seam allowances into the cuffs. I pin the inner cuffs over the seam. From the right side, I top stitch the cuffs flush with their edges. You're almost there. Now, I pin the sleeves to the armholes, making sure that the sleeve seam matches up with the side seam, that notch 11 on the sleeve matches up with notch 11 on the front, and that the notch of the sleeve head matches up with the shoulder seam. I hold on to the sleeve head between the stitches. Then, I stitch the sleeves and knit the seam allowances together. I press the seam allowances into the dress at the sleeve head. I baste the piping on the long edges and one end of the two ties, clipping its flat ribbon in the corners. I pin the ties without piping to the ties with piping right sides together. I stitch them together, starting with and ending at the long edges. I clip the corners at an angle and turn the ties right side out. I top stitch the ties, flush along the piping, and press the edges. I neaten the open end. I pin the ties to the side seams by placing them on the fronts. I stitch the ties into the side seams. If you'd like, you can fold the ties over their seam and top stitch them 0.5 centimeters from their edge. It's almost done. I place the pattern of the waistband and the facing on the right side of the dress, and I mark the location of the buttons with a pin. I sew the top part of the snap buttons on the markings. I pin the right front on the left front by overlapping the middle lines, transfer the button locations to the wrong side of the dress, and sew the bottom part of the snap buttons. Finally, I sew the remaining snap button on the right side of the left waistband end and on the wrong side of the right waistband. And there you have it, your dress is ready to be worn. It's perfect for warm days at the beach or as a lightweight frock to wear in town. Check out our social media for more inspiration. We hope you had fun sewing this and look forward to seeing you next time for another sewing lesson with Burda.